In the cardiac cycle, the most important thing to remember is that blood moves down a pressure gradient, and the pressure is created by the contraction of the muscles in the walls of the chamber that the blood is moving from. So if you start with atrial systole over here, basically what's happening is you have the contraction of the atrial walls. That creates the pressure in here to be much higher than the pressure in here. That's because as you contract these walls, you make the chamber volume decrease, which leads to a greater pressure. This greater pressure forces open these two parts of the valve, and blood moves from the atrium down into the ventricle, down a pressure gradient. Similarly, over on this side, the left hand side of the heart, contraction of the atrial walls reduces the volume, increases the pressure, and blood moves down. Next is ventricular systole. So as the ventricular walls contract, have the same situation, you are creating a smaller volume in the ventricle, which creates a greater pressure. That pressure pushes back on the valves, the atrioventricular valves, and so thereby closes those. This means that blood cannot go back into the atrium because the valves have now closed. The only way that it can go is out of here through the semilunar valves. The next step is diastole. Diastole just means relaxation. So this is where you have no contraction of your atrial walls, no contraction of your ventricular walls, thus the volume inside is sufficient to allow the higher pressure of blood outside to enter the atria, and then some will start to fill up into the ventricles as well. These valves here will be shut purely because the pressure up here will be greater, and that will force these to be closed so that there's no backflow back into the ventricles. So to transfer all of this data onto a graph, the typical graph that you have shows closed, open, closed, open. So this refers to the valves COCO. Down here, where you have a pressure in the atria that is higher than the pressure in the ventricles, you have the valves open. So blood moves out of the atrium into the ventricle. Then as the pressure in the ventricle, this red line, starts to increase, that forces shut the atrioventricular valves. That's where we start here on this graph. So that closes your atrioventricular valve. The pressure in the ventricles continues to rise. It rises so that it's greater than the pressure in the arteries away from the heart, and that forces open the semilunar valves. Then that starts to fill up the arteries. As the pressure then in the arteries goes above that of the pressure in the ventricle, you then find the semilunar valves closing. The ventricle pressure then drops as you get ventricular diastole. This means that the ventricular pressure will eventually go below that of the atria, and as a consequence of that, that will cause the atrioventricular valves to open once again and allow the filling of the atria and ventricles during the diastole.